Morning. My name is Meetu Kapur. I'll be moderating this next session. After this very thought-provoking address that we had from President Perez this morning, and as he very articulately stated that agriculture is a concert, so we have the players of our orchestra here who are going to help us work this into a call for action and construct the next steps. I'd like to introduce our panelists. We have with us Dr. Ashok Gulati, Chair Professor of Agriculture at Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, formerly also Chairman of the Commission for Agriculture Costs and Prices. We have with us Professor Daniel Chamovitz, the Dean of the George S. Weiss Faculty of Life Sciences at Tel Aviv University, and the founder of the Manna Center Program in Food Safety and Security. Lots of extensive experience in plant biology and also in setting up multidisciplinary research in the area of agriculture. We're also joined by Ross Fitzgerald, Director of Visy Industries, the world's largest family-owned recycling and packaging company. He's also the founding CEO of Spectrum Venture Management, a UK-based venture capital business, a keen follower of what we can do collaboratively to look at both energy, water, and agriculture security with extensive experience in this domain. So welcome. As we heard this morning about the challenges that lie ahead of us, I think I just wanted to open up this morning by saying that the last few decades have shown an emerging resilient agriculture sector. We have started to push the frontiers of hitting 4% growth. We've had a record production year in terms of food grains. India is the #1 producer in dairy, second largest in fruits and vegetables. Having said that, I think there's also a set of realities that is facing us. While we're seeing an increase in production, what we're seeing is a commensurate increase in most cases of land being brought under production. And hence, we're not seeing the productivity-led story that we would like to see for the future. Similarly, while we're seeing a very resilient sector emerge, we have to be cognizant of the fact that less than 35% of our arable land is irrigated, and we are heavily dependent on rainfall. And with the increasing change in temperatures and with variability in rainfall, this is a reality that we will have to contend with. President Perez stated there is an imbalance between the Lord in the heaven and the farmer on the earth, and that's really the challenge that we're faced with. So with that, to open up the discussion, I'd like to request Dr. Gulati to share his views and thoughts on some of the key challenges facing the sector today.
And distinguished audience, let me share with you 3 basic facts which can kickstart the discussion on the need and how to get the second green revolution on the ground. 1, by 2028, India is going to surpass the population of China. So we will be the most populous country on this planet. Second, between now and 2030, we will add at least 200 million people more in the cities. Urbanization, the way it is increasing, today a little less than 400 million people are there, and by 2030, 600 million people will be there in cities. If we have to house them properly, you need to create 1 Chicago every year till 2030. And these people are likely to have more incomes, and they are going to demand food. And that food has to come from the hinterlands and other places, which will need value chains. Third fact on the table I want to put is today an average household in India is still spending 45% of its expenditure on food. 45% of its expenditure on food. And last, if I may add, given the optimism in the country, we are expecting between now and 2030, the per capita income would be increasing anywhere between 5 to 6% per annum. Now you add all these things together and look at what is going to happen. You have highest population on this planet within 14 years. You have high rates of growth of urbanization moving, you have high per capita income growing, and still these are underfed people who are going to demand huge food. And the question that Lester Brown put in case of China in 1995, when China was 1.2 billion people, he wrote, "Who will feed China?" And he said within the next 10, 15, 20 years, the global prices are going to erupt because China's consumption will be so much. What China became in 2005 or 6 or 7, and we saw the global price eruption, that 10 years, 15 years from today, India is going to be another China on the table in terms of demand for food. So that's the challenge, the huge increase in demand that's going to come. From where the supply is going to come, and that's the answer that we are looking forward to. And with what we heard in the morning was human brain, the science, and the innovation that is taking place in different fields. I think all these are going to come together to solve the problem of food and producing food with lesser resources. That's the challenge. It's not just augmenting the productivity per unit of land, it's going to be also augmenting the productivity per unit of water, recycling of water, starting with the seed, which is a catalyst of change, but other resources, land and water that are going to go into it, and fertilizers, how best we can use. There is huge inefficiency. There is at present, I would say, misuse of many of these resources, and there is tremendous potential to save. The world is talking already, moving from green to gene revolution and from gene to brown revolution, which is the precision agriculture. And given the database and IT revolution, everything, how much water is there in the soil, how much fertilizer is needed, and how much of N and P, K need to be, everything is being decided by the machines through computerized analysis and with satellite helps. So that's where the frontiers of science are moving. How can we bring that in a country like India? I think we have the human resources, we have the scientific background. If we can send a mission to the Mars at the lowest cost possible, I think there is a possibility of creating a very low cost with the biggest bang for the buck that one can invest, also create enough food, not just for India, but also for sub-Saharan Africa or other South Asian countries, because these are the two hot spots in the world where I think still growth is going to create huge demand for them. Last point that I want to say in my short remarks, there was an issue raised about malnutrition, and can science also agriculture, green revolution. So green revolution of tomorrow is not just producing more of wheat and rice. It is also producing better and more nutritious food, high value products, but also within wheat and rice and even pearl millets. Already there is, I think Harvest Plus has released very soon, iron rich pearl millet. They are bringing zinc rich wheat. Golden rice was held up because it was genetically modified, but these other crops are not. So you have the science where you can improve the nutrition of the plant, which will improve the nutrition of the human beings. So science frontiers, and what we heard from His Excellency in the morning was medical farming literally. So that's another area that can be explored. So in the initial, I think I'm optimist that we can create, and science has no barriers. Right and left, we have people from two different continents, and if brains come together, and if I say science, birds and finance has no barriers, together it can create synergy to feed India well, to the rest of the world well.
Thank you, Dr. Gulati, for those opening remarks, which is a nice pivot to bring in our next speaker, Professor Chamovitz. Israel has been acknowledged as the leader in pushing the frontiers of agricultural modernization. And with everything that we've seen, with less than 3% of the population working to produce more than 95% of Israel's food demands, science has, of course, played a key role. Based on what you've heard Dr. Gulati say at this point, and the vantage point of your experience, where do you see the science-based interventions really bringing the most bang for the buck in this partnership?
Well, first of all, I can't start without thanking both the Ananta Center and the Pratt Foundation for including academia and Tel Aviv within this dialogue, because it's not to be taken for granted that we bring together biologists, academicians in government and in finance to really look at the comprehensive solutions that we're looking for. And I want to continue on with the motif of optimism. And I'm a huge optimist, and the reason I'm an optimist is because of India. And I think what the question is not the second green revolution to feed India, but it's how India is going to feed the world. And the reason I'm an optimist, and I'm just going to recount things that you probably know intuitively, is that I can still remember as a child the threat of famine in the 1960s in Bihar and other states. And India only had 400 million people at this time. If someone would have predicted then that 50 years hence, India would be a net exporter of food, you would have thought that they were crazy. So the fact, and the way that we've done this, or that you've done this, is through technology. It's through the adoption of new technologies, of new agricultural practices. And so if we manage to stave off hunger and famine, the threat of famine, with doubling the population, then the sky's the limit on what we can do in the future. Providing that we accept technology and that we accept research. And I think your Prime Minister said it very succinctly that we have to work on the lab to the land in order to have the second green revolution. Now, we can look for both short-term and long-term solutions. And I think the short-term solutions are definitely more in getting the food to the plate and how we're dealing financially. And these can, minimizing food loss in the food chain. And I think Ross will talk more about this because I'm a scientist. I don't understand how business works completely. But in a long-term solution, any change for a second green revolution is going to start with the seed, as you mentioned. Whereas the first revolution increased yields many-fold over, both from a water point of view and from a land point of view. It came at an incredible cost, a necessary cost, but at a cost, an environmental cost, in the amount of fertilizers we're using, and the amount of pesticides we use, and the amount of inputs. I have no doubt that given the right environment, scientific and governmental environment, we in the agricultural field can develop new strains that will need less water. We can develop new strains that survive in heat, that can use saline water. We can develop new strains that are more nutritious. We can make soybeans and rice that have full protein. These aren't pipe dreams. These just need really academic leadership. Not only, governmental leadership to say that we are promoting this type of agenda. We can double yields. I have no doubt about this. But we have to convince the public that these are not dangerous technologies, and the technologies are not dangerous. You know, there was just an incredibly important study published that showed the effect of GM, and I know that this is a very loaded issue, but it has to be put out there. We can't be afraid of it. Not on people, because people are, but on cows in the United States. And, hundreds of millions of animals have been fed GM crops. And over the past 20 years, there is no difference in their health, in their genetic makeup. And this needs to be said loud and clear. So GM, for example, is not an answer for everything. But what we need to do is open up our toolbox. And our toolbox has to be filled with every technology possible. And to close part of the toolbox because of political expediency is a problem. And so I'm convinced now that if the first revolution was maybe led by science from the United States coming into India, the second green revolution is going to be led by Indian science. It's going to be led by Indian agriculture. And I wouldn't be surprised if in 50 years the exports from India, the yields are not only feeding the Indian public, but are also feeding Africa and are also feeding Israel. You know, we talk about, you know, we're a small country. We like to think we're the center of the world. It's, you know, we're only about 7 million. We produce, only 20% of Israel is agriculturally viable. But still we produce upwards of 85% of all of our food needs. And we do this in areas that plants should not be grown in. And the only way we've been able to do this is through technology. And if we could do that, if we could produce all of our vegetables in the desert, you know, maybe that type of thinking, we can export our thinking. But it's all going to be done here. But we will need to import the grains from India to Israel, because we don't grow wheat, we don't grow rice, we don't grow soybeans. We need you to increase your yields so that we can continue importing these things.
I think from hearing from how Israel has made the desert bloom, moving on, and this is the next question is for Ross, is to say, we've seen the food processing industry play an enormous role in terms of driving growth. And I think Australia's story has been extremely unique in that even though the contribution of agriculture to GDP is only 3%, but if you look at the value addition that happens through the entire sector, it contributes to almost double-digit, almost 20% upwards of Australia's exports. And that's a real success story. So where are the learnings from there, and what do you see as the role of the food processing industry in adding value to this?
Well, thanks, Meetu. I want to also thank Kiran Pasarika and her team for the Ananta Centre for raising such a wonderful day. And I also would like to acknowledge the excellent work already being done at the government-to-government bilateral level. Firstly, between India and Israel, most notably through their 20 Indo-Israeli agricultural centres of excellence. And of course, Ambassador Daniel Carman has been a great champion in this, not only in his current role, but in his former role as the head of Mashav. Secondly, between India and Australia, most notably between the Indian Council of Agricultural Research and the Australian Centre of International Agricultural Research. And here I would like to also acknowledge the Australian High Commissioner, Patrick Suckling, and of course we're joined from ICRIER by Peter Horn and Kuhu Chatterjee, so welcome for coming all this way. If I may, I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of Mrs. Jean Pratt, the co-founder of the Pratt Foundation, and the CEO of the Pratt Foundation, Mr. Sam Lipsky. Thank you very much to both of you. As has been mentioned, I thought I'd just sort of recap on the day. As has been mentioned, today is very much the launch of a trilateral Track 2 food and water security dialogue between India, Israel and Australia. And just to talk about the way forward, we want today's conversation to be the start of a very inclusive conversation, harnessing the complementary skills of our three partner nations, but also engaging all Indian-based businesses, regardless of the nation that they come from. Particularly, as you mentioned, Meetu, the food and beveraging processing companies. After all, they are the key source of demand for smallholder farmers. And this is a major focus of the Pratt Foundation, is increasing the livelihoods and productivity of smallholder farmers. The Asian Development Bank, excuse me, the Asian Development Bank, analysing Asian poverty reduction, see improving the livelihoods and productivity of smallholder farmers as 4 times more effective at reducing poverty than the next best alternative. So what better way to focus our energies, our capital, our minds? In terms of the objectives of our trilateral dialogue, I'd like to suggest that we focus on 5 interconnected objectives. The first is increasing the food and water security of India. Secondly, supporting Prime Minister Modi's vision of a second green revolution right across the full supply chain. So not just on farm, but food processing, distribution, storage, and the whole packaging infrastructure. Thirdly, again, as Meetu alluded to, the Prime Minister's Make in India campaign. The relevance for this conversation is very much food processing. India processes less than 10% of the agricultural produce in this country. This leads to a lack of value add, it leads to a lack of income for farmers, and it actually also exacerbates the food waste issue, which I'll talk about later. And of course, if we do all these things right, we'll come back to our central mission, which is improving the livelihoods and productivity of smallholder farmers in India. And finally, we want to, as you mentioned, the power of business. We want to do what we can to promote investment right throughout the supply chain. So not just in farms, but food processing, the distribution, transportation, storage, and food packaging infrastructure. So they would be the sort of 5 interconnected objectives that we would suggest that we focus on. In terms of where do we go from today, our suggestion would be over the next few weeks and months that we consult carefully with key stakeholders within India before we actually select a scalable project that we can collectively work on. And my message to the audience is that we would welcome input from everyone in this room, or indeed anyone else you suggest that we consult with. The selection of our project, I would suggest, should be based on our collective assessment of India's greatest food and water challenges. And again, collectively, where we judge that we can add greatest value. Just in terms of what those challenges are, Ashok and Danny mentioned them, but just to sort of give you my perspective and perhaps sort of an international perspective, I think this audience well understands the food and water security challenges of India. But it's worth just reminding ourselves that in the judgment of highly regarded international organisations such as McKinsey, that India actually faces in quantitative terms the biggest water security challenge in the world. So many of you will recall that in its 2030 Water Resources Group report, McKinsey forecast on a business as usual basis that India's demand for water by 2030 will exceed supply by 50%. That's equivalent to a gap of 750 billion cubic metres of water, more than 3 times the comparable gap of China. Now, of course, India's water security challenge is, of course, fundamental to India's food security challenge. So, in addition to the water-related challenges of food security, as Dr. Gulati has mentioned on many occasions, India's agricultural producers are comprised 85% smallholder farmers. And most of them aren't fully integrated to competitive supply chains. And so therefore, many of them struggle to make a reasonable livelihood, and many of them fail to, or find it difficult to attract finance to improve productivity and technology adoption, and also to weather the volatilities in price and bad weather seasons. And as I alluded to earlier, India also processes less than 10% of the agriculture produced here. That compares with typically 50% in most countries in the world. Now, when combined with limited investments in transport, storage, and packaging infrastructure, we actually witness in India food wastage in excess of 30%. And as Prime Minister Modi is fond of quoting, in India, in many respects, we've got enough food. What we face is really a food distribution and food management challenge. And that's sort of a big issue that we'd like to sort of focus on in the coming weeks. So, ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, it is clear to this audience that India does indeed face major water and food security challenges. However, we're all optimists on this panel. We believe that these challenges can and will be met. India is a great nation. It is blessed with great leadership and great talent. In a little more than a decade, as Dr. Gulati mentioned, India will be the most populous nation on earth, and shortly thereafter will have the biggest middle class on earth. In our judgment, India represents the world's greatest opportunity to make a difference. So let's do it together. Thank you.
Thanks, Ross. I think with that, I want to come back to some of the opening comments that Dr. Gulati made. We've talked a lot about the supply-led interventions that have happened. But you touched upon demand as being a key point where we need to focus our intervention. So when we look at aggregation and we look at the demand centers, what do you see as the structural transformation and the change that needs to be brought into the system to catalyze more investment?
If we are talking about revolution, Normally we see revolution through a seed on the ground. I somehow feel that the future revolution, if you have to observe, you have to see the revolution in the thali. That is, how the consumption patterns are changing in this country. The revolution, as the income is increasing, revolution is taking place in the thali. Thali is a plate. People are not going to consume more of rice and wheat per capita. In fact, the per capita consumption of rice and wheat is consistently declining in this country. What is going to add on the thali is high value product, more of cheese or meat or milk or fruits and vegetables. And interestingly, of the total agri GDP or value of agriculture output, cereals don't account for more than 23% of the output. Whereas our policy of food security and everything, 80% we hear only of wheat and rice. In terms of value, it's less than 1/5, roughly 1/5, 22, 23% today. So the real opportunity for the farmer to augment his income is in the high value agriculture space. Now the problem is that these are smallholders. They don't have access to cheap and easy finance to start with, because it will need more capital to increase that, and they are operating in totally fragmented value chains. Now when they are operating in fragmented value chains, the farmer may be throwing his tomatoes on the road at 2 rupees a kg. The consumer in Delhi or Mumbai would still be paying 20 rupees or 30 rupees a kg. So how do you make the improvement? That's where the challenge and opportunity for businesses. That you change the rules of the game. This archaic system of mandis, Agriculture Produce Marketing Committee Act, which does not allow the farmers to directly sell to the business outside that mandi, and that's where the disproportionate commission is taken away from the value chain. I think the new government has started off by changing what we had been asking for the last 10 years in Delhi, which is supposed to be Asia's biggest fruit and vegetable market. 15,000 tons every day is coming here. They have changed the law, but there are no alternative options to fall back on, so the farmer doesn't know where to sell it directly. But at least prices can be tamed where farmer can get a better price and consumer will pay a lower price by fixing the value chains. So much of the game is going to be with business directly operating with the smallholders, aggregating right in the rural space. That's where they can create the infrastructure. We did that in case of milk. How did we turn around? I want to give that example that we talked in the World Economic Forum. In 1951, India's production of milk was only 17 million tons, 17. And US at that time was at 56 million tons. US today is at 91, 92 million tons, and India's production of milk is 136 million tons, from 17 to 136. And there are no farmers with 200 cows or 100 cows. It's all household activity where there are 3 or 4 or 5. So it has been done by the smallholders. Milk was aggregated in the villages. A basic infrastructure was created for chilling, and then logistics were created to transport that in the urban areas where it was pasteurized, homogenized, and within 24 hours it was put in a polypack or other sources where it is brought to your house. If milk, a perishable product, can be brought, why can't we do a similar revolution in fruits or vegetables? And because that's where the wastage is about 25–30% at least. And you have to create a huge supply chain in the entire system, and that's where. So my submission to the partners here, because you have better advanced supply chains already existing, I think if we think of whether a little institution or a project base or whatever, one part of that can look into the technologies, the best practices from the seed to water saving and all that, which is the production side. But 75% of India's agriculture is in the high value domain, which is perishable. And therefore, agri-business activity, what are the best agri-business activities dealing with smallholders, which can give a larger share to the smallholder and still can do justice to the consumer? What sort of investments and what sort of institutional engineering is needed that can be brought in? So this synergy of the three nations can have two parts: agri-technologies on one side, best practices, and agri-business on the other, and one will reinforce the other to do this. This is a thought on the table, and whichever form it takes, that would be great to see flourish.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Gulati. So I think as we talked about the need for innovation across the entire value chain, Israel's done a tremendous amount of work in terms of bringing this technology actually to bear and looked at commercialization of technology. What, Danny, if I may turn to you, is required for us to unleash that same kind of innovation in the Indian context? We've had very successful bilateral research programs. We have centers of excellence that we've set up in partnership with Israel as well. However, as we look at the investments in R&D in India and what actually reaches the field, we still don't have the return that we've seen in Israel. What do you think needs to change in that ecosystem?
Well, I'm a little hesitant to talk about what needs to change in the Indian government economic ecosystem, and you can maybe, so let me just say why it worked in Israel, and then you can take for what needs to work in India. What differentiates agriculture from, let's say, high-tech and cybersecurity is that the return on investment is so long. If you want to make $1 million in high tech, you could do something today and then 6 months later do a sellout. But that doesn't work in ag. The rates of return could be anywhere from 15 years to maybe, if you're lucky, several years. And so what we've been able to build on in Israel through our history is huge government investment through cooperatives, through research centers, that in the end filtered down to the small-scale farmer. Now, our small-scale farmer is maybe on 100 acres. It's not, but that's by Israeli still a small-scale farmer. Without the need of business to see an immediate return. And it's only recently, once we had these technologies developed, which were developed in government and public labs, that then that could be taken over and tweaked through business. There's very few agro-businesses which have pockets deep enough to do the basic research that's needed. And so it really takes an interaction between government agencies, farmers' agencies, and academia to really map out what the long-term strategy is. And then once those technologies are developed, then you can open the door. Or then you won't even have to open the door. Then the private sector will become running in because they can see then where the return is going to come from. That's not anything new. That's what happened in the United States also. The first green revolution was pushed through USDA laboratories, USDA investments, which only, hybrid corn was not developed by Pioneer. It was not developed by Monsanto. It was developed in USDA laboratories. And the return at that time took 30 years. Now, what company is going to wait 30 years for a return? So the government has to be involved, but we have to find ways of having public funding, public initiative done in an efficient manner. And how India can do that in an efficient manner, I leave that one to you. If you have, But if I understand correctly, your new government is actually pushing in that area. No, I think I'll leave it at that. I think that's...
just to quickly respond to the proposition you are putting on the table that the government needs to invest more heavily in long-term research. Yes, I agree with the principle. But what is the reality? The reality is government is investing around $600 million a year less than 3,500 crores on agriculture research. One company in the world, Monsanto, is putting $1.5 billion a year into research. So the future of agriculture, whether it is going to come from the government investments or from the private sector, and that's where the IPR question starts coming in, much of this is, the past was the government investment within US and others, but the future, I'm not sure whether it is the government investments that are, you look at the cotton revolution that India had in the last 10 years, you look at corn revolution that India is at present going through, they're all private sector led. So whether, maybe we can have a good synergy between the private sector and the public sector, but private sector has gone ahead much more in investments in agri-research than the government's, so major correction has to be done.
Just one quick response. You're 100% correct, except that the huge work that was done in cotton and the huge that's been done in corn is all based on original government-funded research, which was then tweaked by industry. Now, the thing where I think where we have to work, and if we had built on private industry to develop those technologies, they would never have been developed.
Well,
the question, though, I think is publicly funded research focused in the right area? And here there's a lot of work that can be done. And this is where we definitely need to be having all three sectors talking to each other to be doing focused research on where the highest impact can be. And I'll give one quick example on research that actually was done by one of my collaborators at Tel Aviv University, which was looking at the impact of irrigation and the impact of climate change, temperature, on yields in India. And he did this throughout the entire country. It was funded by an Indian foundation. And, and most of our research is going on water and drought-resistant crops. But it ended up that if we look at wheat, the biggest threat to wheat yields was not the availability of water, when you actually tease out all of it, was a change of 2 or 3 degrees in the annual temperature at the time of flowering. And I know that when we heard these, when we were presented with these results, it made us think. I said, maybe all of our research is wrong. We're all looking for drought-resistant. Maybe we need to be focusing on changes in 2 or 3 temperatures in developing plants that are that sensitive. Now, these are difficult propositions, but it was the meshing of economic research being presented to biologists, which may lead to a new agenda.
I think on that note, Ross, I'd like to bring you in. You are the agribusiness representative on this panel. Where do you weigh in on this discussion in terms of the balance between public-led research and the role that the private sector has to play?
Well, look, they both play a vital role. I think the policy issue on the quality and the quantum of spend, I mean, that's always an issue. I think what's an interesting, just to be an international citizen for a second, rather than a particular country focus, it's interesting if one looks at one of the countries that's really grown in the last 20 years as an agricultural middle power, approaching a superpower. One looks at Brazil, and Brazil spends about 1.8% of its GDP on public agricultural research. I think Dr. Gulati, the Indian equivalent would be around 0.4%, 0.5?
0.6 to 0.7 now.
Okay.
It used to be 0.4.
Okay.
We have improved, but we are still at 0.6 to 0.7 in between.
So Brazil, in percentage terms, spends about 3 times the level in India. The other thing that I think we can all learn from, including Australia and all countries, is that Brazil has had a very, as Danny mentioned, Brazil has had a very focused and centralized approach to its public ag R&D under one umbrella organization called Embrapa, and there's been a very, very strong commercial focus in that. But I just wanted to add, just to try and draw a few of link the issues here. I very much agree with Dr. Gulati's central point, and indeed Jamshid Godrej made the same point. And many other reports, I think your report, Meetu, CII, FACE, the BCG report, IFID internationally, make the point that the issues of, the foundational issue for improving the livelihoods and productivity of smallholder farmers and increasing food and water security. The foundational issue is very much one of aggregating and organising farmers and integrating them into the full supply chain. And we are very fortunate to have the Indian Authority on this issue, so it's a pleasure to be sitting next to you on this. Mm-hmm. But the point that many people make is when we get that absolutely as best we can, because it improves the livelihoods and the livelihoods of farmers by increasing their marketing economies, it gives them more income to take advantage of the new technologies that are being developed. Now, of course, in the Indian context, innovation is going to need to be frugal innovation. We need to adapt. If we're to introduce Western technology, we need to make them adapted for local conditions, because after all, you know, there are nearly 100 million smallholding farming units. Many of them don't have large sums of money. But I just wanted to make sort of one other design point, just something that we've learned from the Foundation's perspective on the ability to integrate smallholder farmers with big food processing companies. At the Pratt Foundation, we back an Australian NGO called Business for Millennium Development. And their specialist focus is actually creating what they call links, L-I-N-C. And they've set them up in Myanmar and other parts of Southeast Asia. And the central design feature is that they set up independently run management organisations that are run by trusted local people, that are jointly owned by farmers and jointly owned by a large food producer, and it's run for mutual benefit. And see, the importance of aligning the interests of farmers and the big food processing companies is critical, because the food processing companies are the consistent long-term source of demand. And that's going to be that's the key to predictability and bankability for farmers. And so these are all the issues that I'd like us to continue to look at in the coming weeks, and to see whether there's a way that we can draw all of the complementary skills that not just our 3 partner countries have, but also working with the multinational food and beverage companies in India.
Sure. Thank you for that pivot to the discussion I wanted to bring us to, which was around value chains. And you articulated the need for this to be anchored in demand and then build supply chains and value chains around that. Dr. Gulati, my question to you would be, you know, we've seen examples of this, like you said, in dairy. And as we look at value chains being constructed, some of the barriers we've seen to scale is this whole concept of sharing risk. And that is where often enough, these value chains don't go where they're intended to go, and also the lack of financing. What would be your views in terms of how we address some of those issues?
You know, 2 things that we should keep in mind developing the value chain. And I would like to go back to what India has given as a model to the rest of the world, which is dominated by smallholders, the question of milk, building the value chain by Amul and others in the game. Who invested in the beginning? It's not the private sector that came in. In fact, it was the EU aid at that time that was coming in, which was monetized, and that money was invested in creating a huge infrastructure to aggregate milk, chill it there, then transport it in refurb, you know, tanks and others. The cold chain was created and brought it for processing and distribution. Yep. Land was given. There are 1,000 booths which are given by the government in prime lands within Delhi where the milk is to be distributed. Now, if that thing has to be replicated by the private sector, it needs huge investments, borrowing from the banks at 10%, 12% rate of interest. They would need returns. That's where public-private partnership can come together to, in a way, reduce the risk that you are saying, because somebody has to invest upfront. Now, the biggest challenge, the second part of the game, that's where I think the Indian policy is somewhat upside down. We talked about agri-R&D and Brazil spending 1.8% of agri-GDP on agri-R&D.
Yeah.
India spending only 0.6 to 0.7%. But India spends $12 billion on fertilizer subsidy. It spends equivalent amount on power subsidy, free power, highly subsidized urea, food subsidy, which is $20 billion plus. Now, when you are putting the cart before the horse, the subsidy baggage, and the investment baggage is only 1/10 of that, what do you expect? You have a limping production base, very shaky production base. 80% of the resources going to agriculture today, public resources, government resources going to agriculture today are going in the form of subsidies. And during my old days with IFPRI, we did studies in 5 countries. What is the marginal return if you have to spend $1 billion, whether you should be spending in fertilizer subsidy or power subsidy or irrigation subsidy, or you should be spending on agri R&D or rural roads or irrigation development, investment versus subsidies. The returns, marginal returns, are 5 to 10 times higher if that money is spent in investments than in subsidies. So the political challenge is, how do you convert this 80% subsidy to just 20% subsidy and 80% investments? If we can do that, I think India can feed not only itself but Israel as well as Sub-Saharan Africa, many other countries. I think that's the biggest political challenge for India.
Right. So as we grapple with some of those challenges, I sort of also wanted to move on to the next part of the discussion, which is President Perez sort of laid out this morning the need for call for action, the need for scientists to step up and take risk. And we've seen that being done across Israel, Australia, and of course, we've seen degree of innovation in India as well. So I want to turn to you, Professor Chamovitz, at this point and say, what do you see as the key factors to ensure that the investment in science and the appetite for risk continues to support the trajectory that countries are on?
I think that what we need to see is that scientists, like anyone in the field, we want to first of all know that we're being listened to. And so that's the risk that we're taking. But I think the risk that we need to take is to say that not that we're going to give you in funding agencies, they're looking for a return again from 2 years. I need to be able to tell the government, a funding agency, a company, that my research now in 10 years will lead a crop that is more environmentally sustainable. That 10 years from now, our research will lead to tomatoes, wheat, rice. And yes, it's only 10 or 20% of the value of the investment, but how much of the water is it using? If we could cut the water use in rice through precision breeding by half, what would be the downstream effect on other aspects of Indian agriculture? So we need the leadership to be able to say, no, we're not going to have immediate answers, that our answers are long-term, but that we will be able to do it. And the key issue, just from the plant point of view, has to be in sustainability. We have to be working on crops that will allow any country to maintain its natural resources, to maintain a clean water supply, that won't be putting poisons into our children's food, and that will still be able to do it in a financially responsible way. And here is the understanding what each country's needs are. That will be affordable for the small-scale farmer. And as Ross mentioned, that it will be for the small-scale farmer, not for feeding himself, but for designing the supply chains, which will enrich him economically, so that his children will have a better life. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that's where I think our challenge is for the future.
Sure. I think with that, Ross, also, you alluded earlier to, as we talk about sustainability, so one is on the input side, but the other is also on the waste that we're seeing. What, in your experience, has been the role that industry has been able to play effectively in Australia to be able to address some of these concerns?
Well, again, I would answer that question again from the supply chain perspective, because there are innovations right along the chain that can reduce food waste. So if we take at the farm gate, if we take an Israeli example, because we want to be international and not pushing one particular country. When Sam Lipsky and I were in Israel earlier this year, we went to the Volcani Institute, and they showed us these incredible oranges that had been picked 6 months before, and they were succulent. So they have developed seeds that extend the shelf life of fruits and vegetables. So that's sort of one innovation at the farm gate with the seeds, which of course, Danny, this is what you focus on. The other improvement opportunity is then into the food processing part of the chain. As I alluded to earlier, India processes less than 10% of the agricultural products produced here. That can be, the vision should be to increase that by 5 times. The more we process here, the less likelihood of food wastage. So that's that part of the chain. Then you get to transport, storage, and packaging. And again, the more we can invest there and the more innovation there, Anthony Pratt referred to a wonderful piece of packaging technology that Israel has just developed, extending the shelf life of products. There are a variety of packaging innovations, but the whole point of improving storage facilities, Prime Minister Modi talks about decentralized warehousing. It's very much part of his second green revolution. And of course, improving road and rail. These are the things that, these holistic things all need to be done to reduce food waste.
Sure. So what we've heard this morning is really a spectrum of areas that need to be addressed across the value chain. While we've talked a little bit about the production system, we've also talked about the layer of policy and political will and structural transformation that will need to come about. But more importantly, I think what we've heard resonating across the panelists is the focus on science and technology. The call for action and the willingness to take risk if we are to be able to collaborate and move this forward. So I'm going to pose my final question to the panelists, and then I'd like to bring the audience in for some amount of Q&A as well. I know at the outset we said we would not prioritize projects, but I'd be keen to hear from you individually what you would cite as the top 3 priorities that need immediate addressal. So maybe Dr. Gulati, if you could start with that.
Well, I think first is trying to save what the large wastages are. So I would first focus on building better value chains in perishable commodities so that all the resources we have already spent in producing those at least can reach the stomach of human beings, finally. So that would be, I would say, a high return activity. That's one. Second priority, I think we have to, it's a wake-up call for India to understand the value of water. So I think our whole talk has been all these 50 years, 60 years on land productivity. And I always give that example of rice, where 1 kilogram of rice is taking 3,000 to 5,000 liters of water. And we are creating an unsustainable base in Punjab where every year the water table is going down by 33 centimeters. Now we cannot really afford that. There are policy issues there, but there are also technologies which can give us an answer. So I think focus on water saving technologies and policies associated with that. My feeling is the third priority, if I can put, all these years of food security we thought how to fill up our stomach, but the micronutrient deficiency is very acute, and I think Indian population has the largest malnourished children in the world. And if we can get science, make more nutritious food which are basic staples of low value, that's where science can get in. These 3 things, we can change the landscape of food security and nutritional security.
Sure. Ross, your views?
Yeah, my top 3 would be very similar to Dr. Gulati's, and indeed the BCG report that I would encourage you to read if you haven't, written in July 2012. the foundational issue is very much organising and aggregating, if you like, and integrating smallholder farmers into the value chain. And Dr. Gulati is exactly right. The catalyst to our move was essentially, philanthropic. And this is very much the vision of the Pratt Foundation. This is what we've been doing in other parts of Southeast Asia. It's to back the creation or help to scale up a non-profit organisation run by a trusted local Indian who runs the organisation for the mutual benefit of smallholder farmers and a big food processing company. This is the vision that we've seen work. I think it's a vision that's consistent with what you've seen work. Of course, there are many models, but if we get that foundational issue right, then what that does is it then leads to the ability for greater technology adoption, which is the second point that I think you raised. And then it also, if one aggregates smallholder farmers into sort of agri-hubs, which is very much your vision, then it allows us to address the water issue. It allows communities to fund drip irrigation more effectively. I mean, Jane has got a wonderful, low-cost, good value model, but this can be penetrated more if we aggregate and organise farmers for the mutual benefit of the whole supply chain. You have the drip irrigation, you have the infrastructure built around it, the storage and the packing facilities. That would be our vision. But of course, we need to, consult and work out what we want to do.
Sure, Danny. Any final comments?
Well, no, I'm just smiling to myself because I think I've just proven to myself the importance of dialogue and now trialogue, because over the past year and a half or so, Dr. Gulati and I have been having a continued dialogue that's been promoted through the Ananta Center. And I guess I've listened to him so much that I just agree 100% to what he had to say, because I've adopted his agenda as my own.
That's almost like everybody here.
Yeah, so I will accept his three there. Yeah.
Great. So at this point, I'd like to open it up for questions. If you could just identify yourself and direct the question to the panelist. We have mics.
I'm Sudha Pillai. I'm formerly from the Indian Administrative Service, and it's been fascinating listening to all the three speakers, and compliments to Meetu for absolutely wonderful moderating. I just hope the Ananta Center will continue this dialogue and ask some of us former government insiders also about why a lot of low-hanging fruit has not been harvested so far. As a matter of fact, the example of the White Revolution, we could have replicated it years back. 10 to 15 years back, actually, we could have replicated it for fruits and vegetables. My major concern would be the dysfunctional irrigation benefit program that actually leads to a large number of sucking out of resources, but the projects never get completed. So these are some of the things that all of us would like to see dismantled. And finally, I think I would like to address this to Ross about food processing. Some of the producer families, when they get into food processing, they ensure that everything is monetized. So do you think there have been any studies which should indicate whether the impact on the producer family children will be negative or positive? Do they eat better or do they eat worse? What is the situation in milk producing families? Does everything get monetized or the children get to drink some of the milk?
In general terms, and this is very much the vision of the food processing minister, in general terms, the aim is to encourage food processing investments to be sited close to where agricultural produce is being grown. The benefit for the producing families is that done well and done, for mutual benefit, income levels of the producing families will go up. It'll be at a high level, it'll be more consistent, and they will be more bankable. So again, this is what we are wanting to do our bit to encourage. It's very much the government agenda. It's the focus of Prime Minister, it's one of the key focuses of Prime Minister Modi's Make in India campaign. And of course, it's a central focus for the food processing minister.
Two short questions. My first question flows from Daniel's pencil note, which you handed over to me in the course of the last session, is that how do these two great nations, Israel and Australia, strengthen India's hands in combating the fury and ferocity of Mother Nature through the use of technology or otherwise, keeping in mind that India still continues, Indian agriculture still continues to be a gamble in the monsoons. The second question, of course, flows from a historical context, you see. When my good friend and mother figure Indira Gandhi launched India's first Green Revolution, she prevailed upon her super scientist, Dr. M.S. Ramanathan, to contact Mexico's top agriculture scientists who had developed a hybrid wheat through the use of ancient American Indian techniques, and that was first grown in the garden of the Mexican ambassador in Delhi, Octavio Paz, who won the Nobel Prize, and that led to India gaining self-sufficiency in food production through the use of that hybrid wheat and India's complete freedom from American wheat supplies, you see. So these are the two questions to which I'd like you to give us your answers.
Sure, excellent questions.
I mean, the hybrid dimension.
The whole question of Mother Nature and reducing gamble is by precision agriculture and adopting modern techniques. Agriculture is always open to risk of Mother Nature, which we can't control. So we shouldn't be trying to control that which we can't. But what we can control for two things. One, from a policy perspective, we can make sure that if there is a natural disaster, that we have enough stores to feed our people. That we have enough access, and if we're talking about food security, access is one, that we have access to the food even if there is a major disaster. But the second thing is that we can try to anticipate what these disasters are, not in terms of when they're going to happen, but if I know that one of the potential disasters in a rain-fed country is drought. So the obvious answer is I need to adopt technologies which make me independent of rain. But I need to make sure that this technology is affordable, is accessible to the small-scale farmer. And then I'm less dependent on Mother Nature. Cyclones can come and wipe out things, that's true. But we just have to make sure that the farmer doesn't suffer, that we spread the risk around. Because if the farmer suffers, then he will not take the risk. And then in the end, we won't have enough food.
I think we had a question at the back. Can someone just get the mic across? Yeah, gentleman there.
Someone has that microphone there.
Right over there. Please.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Arvind Bettigri. I'm from the non-profit sector. In the discussions that you had on agricultural innovation and also the food processing industry, I didn't hear any mention about the regulatory environment, because, as food processing industry becomes a mainstay in the country and India is moving in that direction, what would be the regulatory challenges in terms of the regulatory environment, the food regulator, to keep up with the pace of challenge of science, as well as, what capacity building would be required for the regulatory body to keep up pace? Because, food processing industry, agriculture, biofortification, intellectual properties would intrinsically require very close working with the regulatory environment within the country. So.
Dr. Gulati, could you address that?
Well, food safety is the biggest challenge. At present, much of our food is in the informal sector. So even what is happening, what vegetables we are consuming and how much pesticide is there, you know better than me on those issues. So I think the regulatory mechanism institutions are put in place. They have started operating on the ground and pulling up socks. So it's going to be a little more time you have to give. Transformation from an informal system to a more formal system, it's not within 2 years, 5 years you can do, it's a decades that takes place. And accordingly, these institutions will come up. So if there is a regulatory mechanism, I'll put food safety as the biggest challenge and ensuring that. In exports, we have done that in the export market, but in the domestic market, there is still a big question.
So I think we have time for just 2 more questions. If we go here and then to the lady over there. Sorry, we can interact over lunch, but I think we'll have to close. So,
my name is R.P. Lahiri. I'm a small farmer. I have a desire to start on food processing and fruit processing things. Now I attended one seminar, and codex requirement is so stringent that Indian small farmers or small people can never start food processing industries in India because so stringent. Now my question is like this. You have got lot of technologies and lot of strength also. Can a small farmer can directly get some sort of joining hands, collaboration or something with you so that without entangling the bureaucratic systems of everywhere happening, can I get and do? I want to be productive, not to be all these things what is happening. That is my question to all of you.
This is making a call for action.
You know, I would say 10, 15 years back, even we had not thought India would be exporting grapes to European markets. And the first consignment that went, very reluctantly and very cautiously, and it was led by the farmers, Sopan Kanchan, if you know him, and rejection rate was 90%. Because there were high pesticide residues. But that man like you was so determined, he said, nothing doing, I'm going to make it a success story. He got all the farmers together and he said, if we have to get access to that market, we have to first discipline ourselves. This type of spray, no more this, no more that, all the do's and don'ts, he preached to all his groups. Today, the rejection rates are less than 2%, and we are exporting grapes, which is a perishable thing, to European markets. So it can be done, I think, institutional engineering, but the passion and determination, and then you may have got some funds from here or there, government support does come forward in these things. I have seen tens of such examples where they failed, and I think the message that I got, main thing in the morning session from Honorable President Perez was falling is everyone does that, failing, everyone does that, that's our right, but standing up again and walking towards destination, I think that is what, so I would say what Vivekananda said, arise, awake and stop not till the goal is reached. You can do it.
Thank you. Just take one last question there and then we'll interact over lunch.
Two people converging on her at once.
My name is Preeta. I work on the agriculture research and advisory space. I'd like to thank the panel for a very interesting discussion on topical issues. 2 quick questions, one for Dr. Gulati. We discussed a lot on the policy front. I would like to know your views on MSP. Which, what does it really help the smallholders? And secondly, given your mention that a lot of the Indian policy focuses on rice and wheat, how do you think the MSP really distorts that diversification of the crop basket for the farmer? And second question is for Mr. Ross, which relates to the model where you explained about farmer aggregation and bringing together food producers and farmers, which I personally believe is also a very relevant model in the Indian context. But the key question or the elephant in the room is, what's your experience in making this scalable? Because even in India, we've seen a lot of farmer cooperatives, farmer aggregation models succeeding in some states, in some pockets. But how do you make this scalable as a solution for a revolution? Thanks.
Dr. Gulati will take the first part.
Well, MSP regime, minimum support prices, because that's what I was heading earlier, and we used to recommend 23 crops and minimum support prices to the government. But the answer to your question, very short, is MSP regime basically benefits 15% of the farmers in the country, and that too the better off farmers, not the small ones. If you want more details, I can get into that, but that hopefully will.
Madam, I want to ask a related question.
Sorry, 5?
And most important thing is that, 80% of the agriculture all over the world, not just in India, is dependent on wheat, rice, soybean, and such kind of crops. So it's wrong, we have to support these farmers. 80% of area is dedicated to wheat, rice, and corn, and such kind of crops. And we have to support farmers, not just in India, all over the world, to feed our future generations.
Right. I think that's the question that Dr. Gulati was answering in terms of how some of these tools have enabled that. I'll just quickly ask Ross to respond before we wrap up.
You said wheat international price is 500 something? $540 per ton. From where did you get this figure? You show me even $240 a ton today. It's hovering at $235, $225 a ton today. Please check that again. Please, my humble submission is please check that again. $540 a ton for wheat price? No. That's not my understanding. Your basic point that farmers need to be supported, and there is a large area under these basic staples, that's the main point. Yes, even in India, the food grains occupy about 60–65% of the area. But in terms of value of produce, it's a very low value produce. I said it is not more than 23% of the total value of agriculture. So farmers are not just wheat and rice farmers. There are other farmers too. And milk farmers are even smaller farmers. Normally wheat farmers are the bigger farmers. So how much support you can give? Each country has been supporting its farming except a few, Australia, New Zealand and others. But most of the countries, US, Europe, Japan, Korea, India, China, everybody is supporting. There are rules of the game under WTO. More details we can talk about that, how far one can go. It depends upon your pocket also, how much support you can give and how best you can give it without distorting the international and domestic markets.
Thank you, Dr. Gulati. Ross, could you respond to the question on aggregation and scale?
Well, you've really asked the pertinent question, and Meetu's written a number of great reports on this issue too, which I think you call it, how do we scale up the islands of excellence? So there are a lot of great models, a lot of great aggregation models in India, but actually you've asked the pertinent question, how do we scale them up? With perhaps the exception of the Amul example, which has achieved great scale, the reality is, even in countries where we're working as a foundation in Myanmar, the reality is achieving scale is very, very difficult. And so the jury is still out, that still remains a challenge. But our sort of strong belief is that by meshing the mutual interests of the farming community and the food processors, that is the best way for both of them. So now many of the food processing companies have got their own programs. Unilever globally has a vision to actually integrate with 1.5 million smallholder farmers around the world. Nestle, PepsiCo, Coke, similar sorts of visions. What we'd like to do, and what the discussion we'd like to have, and perhaps with this gentleman too afterwards, is there an opportunity for this collective group to harness our collective complementary skills to actually try and scale one of these opportunities up? That's a tall order, but it's a challenge that we need to focus on, because it will improve livelihoods and productivity for smallholder farmers. It will be for the benefit for everybody, and that's what we're about.
Great. So I think at that note, we'll draw this to an end. I think clearly, as we heard all of this morning, while there is a call for action, it's clear that science and technology is the only way to create the balance between the Lord in the heaven and the farmer on the earth. And I think what we've clearly seen over here is also that collaboration and action is the only way forward. So I'll again like to thank the panelists for the time that they've taken to address the questions and share their views. And this dialogue will continue, as we said, with more inputs as we break this down into key priorities to be able to make them into projects and work on this. So thank you very, very much again.
What? No, you looked worried.